Today we're examining some of the most common mistakes that people make in the apologetics and counter-apologetics sphere, as well as common mistakes made in just internet, philosophy, and religion more generally. You'd be surprised at how much we can learn from reflecting on and correcting these mistakes, and that's the purpose of this series. In the previous episode, we covered mistakes relating to theism, atheism, naturalism, and agnosticism, and in today's episode we're looking at mistakes about the Kalam cosmological argument and contingency arguments. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that little bell for notifications so you don't miss the next video in the series. Welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and as I said at the outset, today we're in part 3 of my Common Mistakes series. Definitely check out the playlist, which will eventually house all 7 parts of this series. I already covered some important preliminary points in part 1 of this series, so let's just jump right into the mistakes. Oh, and be sure to check out the resource document linked in the description. So we're going to begin with mistakes on the Kalam, and this is going to take up the majority of this video. But trust me, watching this will significantly enhance your understanding of the Kalam and so many common mistakes that are made in internet discussions about it. Okay, so on to mistake number 73, continuing on from part 2. So many confusions about paradoxes abound in discussions regarding the Kalam. Quite often, especially online, people will make these mistakes when reasoning about paradoxes. For instance, oftentimes people will articulate a contradictory story or scenario or paradox and then hastily conclude from the fact that the story is contradictory that some particular element of the story must be false. But that doesn't follow, right? All that follows is that it cannot be the case that all the elements of the story are jointly true together. You don't get to infer, merely from the facts that the story is paradoxical or contradictory and involves element E, that E is therefore impossible or even false. You can only infer that it's not possible to conjoin E with all the other elements of the story. Right, so let's flesh this out a bit. Any scenario or story is just a conjunction of various claims, P and Q and R and so on. The fact that the story is inconsistent or contradictory or paradoxical implies only that it's not possible that all of those elements are true together. That is, that it is not the case that it's possible that P and Q and R and S and so on. So this whole conjunction is not possible. That's what this little tilde means not, and that little diamond means it is possible that. So it is not possible that the whole conjunction is true. That's all that we can infer from the fact that the story is inconsistent or contradictory or paradoxical or whatever. It is formally invalid to then infer from this that, say, P is impossible. It's formally invalid to infer from that it is not possible that P. You cannot infer from the fact that this whole conjunction is impossible, that an individual conjunct therein is impossible. It just straightforwardly doesn't follow, right? P could be possible, even though it isn't possible to conjoin P with all the other elements of the inconsistent conjunction. To see this formal invalidity, consider the simple case of P. This is the proposition that Joe exists, and not P, which is the negation of that, right? Joe does not exist. Now, clearly, the conjunction of these two propositions is not possible, right? It cannot be the case that both P and not P. It cannot be the case that Joe exists and Joe does not exist, so it's not possible that P and not P. But it would clearly be fallacious to infer that it's not possible that P. Right? You can't infer from the fact that it's not possible that I both exist and don't exist, that therefore my existence is impossible. What? No. And likewise, of course, it would clearly be fallacious to infer the impossibility of the other conjunct within this conjunction. So it is not possible that P is false, or it is not possible that not P. I say here, no, right? Even though the conjunction of those claims is impossible, each of the individual conjuncts is possible. In general, then, we cannot validly infer the impossibility of some particular element of a story merely from the fact that the story as a whole is inconsistent or contradictory or paradoxical. Of course, there is a way to validly infer the impossibility of some particular element of the story if we add the following linking premise. 1, right? I'm going to bold that. Here's the linking premise. If that particular element of the story is possible, well, then the story as a whole would be possible. 2, but the story as a whole is impossible, right? Suppose that the story is contradictory, and so it follows that that particular element of the story is impossible. Right, but notice that this all is compatible with my broader point. My broader point is that simply from the fact that we can tell an inconsistent or paradoxical story involving something, it doesn't follow that that thing is impossible. You would need some additional linking premise in order to infer that. And once the arguer takes on that additional linking premise, they're then saddled with the task of justifying that linking premise. And in general, it actually turns out to be quite difficult to justify that premise, especially in cases when it strikes many like me as implausible. So just because you can tell an inconsistent story involving something, right? Just because you can tell an inconsistent or paradoxical story involving something, it doesn't follow that that thing is impossible. So similarly, just because you can tell inconsistent or paradoxical stories involving infinity, for instance, or involving an infinite past, it doesn't follow that an infinite past is impossible, or that actual infinites are impossible. This mistake is made so often in the context of the Kalam, and people need to stop doing it. So yeah, like I say here, all of this has been quite abstract so far, so let's take a concrete example where the above mistake and ensuing dialectic plays out. So recently I saw a post wherein someone claimed that the paradox of Benedetti's book shows that space cannot be infinitely divisible, but must instead be broken up into smallest discrete units. So this paradox of Benedetti's book, right? Benedetti is a 20th century philosopher who has this amazing book, Infinity, an essay in metaphysics. He's a staunch defender of the actual infinite, but he also constructed various fascinating paradoxes and explored their philosophical ramifications and ways to avoid them, etc. But anyway, one of his paradoxes involves a book, each page of which is half as thick as its preceding page. Its first page is an inch thick, say, its second page is a half-inch thick, its third page is a fourth-inch thick, and so on for infinitely many more pages bunched up into a finitely large book. You can actually mathematically prove that this book has to be exactly 2 inches thick. Now, allegedly, I certainly don't buy this, but allegedly such a book is supposed to be absurd and so impossible, maybe because it has no last page, and so if you carefully, you turn the book over and you carefully open up the back cover, maybe there's just no good answer as to what you would see, because again, there's no last page. Anyway, it's not clear why it's supposed to be absurd, but let's just grant that this sort of book is impossible. Importantly, that doesn't license us to conclude that space cannot be infinitely divisible. It only licenses us to conclude that we cannot combine infinitely divisible space with the existence of such a book, right? By itself, that's perfectly compatible with the possibility of infinitely divisible space. It could simply be that in all those worlds in which space is infinitely divisible, there isn't also a Benedetti book in those worlds. That is, of course, compatible with there being some possible worlds in which space is infinitely divisible. It's just that in all of those worlds, there aren't Benedetti books. So in order for the post's argument to have any hope of success, right, remember the post, it was a post that's trying to prove that space must be broken up into the smallest discrete units by appeal to Benedetti's book. In order to have any hopes of success, it would need not only a premise asserting the impossibility of Benedetti's book, but also it would need to add a linking premise, right? So here's the linking premise. If infinitely divisible space is possible, then Benedetti's book is possible. 2, Benedetti's book is impossible. So infinitely divisible space is impossible. Notice that now the arguer has an additional argumentative burden. It's not enough for them to simply describe a paradox involving infinitely divisible space, right? They need to show that if there could be infinitely divisible space, then there could be that sort of paradox, or then there could be that sort of book. And in addition to shouldering this additional argumentative burden, lots of us will find this linking premise deeply implausible. And I'm in that camp. To my ears, if we really do assume, as 2 urges, that Benedetti's book is impossible, then premise 1, again, to me, is like saying 1 star. Well, if there are angels, then it could be the case that an angel both affects and does not affect someone's life at the same time. I mean, the problem is, well, why should we accept 1 star, right? Why would the possibility of something absurd, namely both affecting and not affecting someone, why would the possibility of something absurd follow from the possibility of angels? I mean, in principle, it could easily be true that angels are possible, even though impossible stories concerning them couldn't exist. Right? After all, I can tell you an impossible story about anything. Angels, taxis, dogs, and so on. But as we've seen, that doesn't license us to infer that those things are impossible. It only tells us that we told an impossible story, and that all the elements of the story cannot jointly obtain. But you don't thereby get to infer that a particular element of that story, say angels or dogs or taxis, is impossible. Again, you could only do so if you add the linking premise that if that particular element is possible, then the impossible story would, in fact, be possible. But just as we shouldn't accept that linking premise in the case of angels, why should we accept it in the case of infinitely divisible space? I mean, again, in principle, it could easily be true that space is possibly infinitely divisible, even though impossible stories concerning infinitely divisible space couldn't obtain or couldn't exist. For instance, stories involving impossible books. It's the same problem as that afflicting the angel case. And this sort of worry is often a problem more generally for the deployment of paradoxes on behalf of premises in Kalam-style arguments. I'm not saying it afflicts every deployment of paradoxes on behalf of premises in Kalam-style arguments, right? I'm not saying that every proponent of the Kalam succumbs to this mistake in reasoning. I'm not saying that. My point is just that it is a common mistake that many people fall into, and that's why I'm covering it in this series. My ultimate aim here is to give you guys tools to think critically, cautiously, carefully, and rigorously about topics that matter. That's like the motto of my channel. And covering these mistakes and explaining where exactly they go wrong and helping you guys see exactly where they go wrong is hopefully making steps toward that ultimate goal. And by the way, here's another concrete example taken from my video New Objections to the Kalam Still Work. A concrete example, that is, of this mistake in action. So here's just a rundown of at least some of the problems that afflict the usage of the Grim Reaper paradox in discussions pertaining to the Kalam. So firstly, you have the unsatisfiable paradiagnosis criticism. The basic thrust of this criticism is that the paradox doesn't arise from there being an infinite past, and it also doesn't arise from there being infinitely many items. You can't get the contradiction merely from the infinite beginningless set of items in question, like there being an infinite beginningless set of entities. You only get the contradiction because you combine that condition of there being an infinite beginningless set of items, you only get the contradiction because you combine that condition with an additional condition, namely that each member of the collection has some property if and only if no earlier member has it. This is what is responsible for the paradox. It's this conjunction of these two conditions which is responsible for the paradox. The first condition is that you have an infinite beginningless set of items, and the second condition is that each member of the collection has some property if and only if no earlier member has that property. Again, you can only get the paradox by combining these two conditions together. The infinite past alone doesn't engender any such paradox. But then all we can conclude from the paradox itself is that an infinite past cannot be combined with Reapers acting in this specified way. In other words, all we are entitled to conclude is that in any world in which the past is infinite, it's not populated by infinitely many Reapers spanning the infinite past, all of whom are such that they successfully implement their intentions to do something if and only if none of the earlier ones do so. That conclusion is entirely compatible with there being worlds in which the past is infinite. It's just that in each such world in which the past is infinite, the past can't be populated in the way described by the paradox. Right, to convey this point differently, imagine that I'm telling you a story, at the beginning of the story, you get into a taxi, and then I talk about where you go, so maybe you're in New York City, you go and see the things that are in New York City. I can't really list them off my head because I've never been to New York City, but you go and see theaters, you go to a restaurant, and you're just getting in taxis this whole time. Afterwards, you go to your hotel, you sleep, you wake up, and then God comes along, reveals himself to you as you wake up and you're eating your bowl of cereal the next morning. And God reveals to you, and this really is God, by the way. This is part of the imaginative story that I'm telling. And God reveals to you, he says to you, you can hear him in your ears. God says to you, you've never gotten into a taxi. The end. So let's think about that story. In that story, you got into multiple taxis the day before, and the day afterwards, God himself comes and reveals to you that you've never been in taxis. But wait, that engenders a contradiction. Because God can't lie, God can't reveal falsehoods. It's part of God's nature, not to lie, not to reveal falsehoods. And so it follows that what God revealed to you is actually true. And so it's both true that you've never gotten into taxis because that's what God revealed to you and God can't lie, can't be mistaken. But it's also true that you have gotten into taxis. Oh no, we've gotten a contradiction. I guess it must follow that, taxis are impossible. Or maybe, I guess it must follow that it's impossible for you to get into a taxi. Or I guess it's impossible for God to reveal to someone that they've never gotten into a taxi. No, each of those is an absurd conclusion to draw from this scenario. All we should conclude from this scenario is that you cannot combine in a single world you getting into a taxi and also God revealing to someone that you never got into a taxi. You can't have both of those true together. You can't impugn either of those individually for this. This argument here doesn't show that you can't get into a taxi. It only shows that you can't get into a taxi in a world in which God also reveals that you never get into a taxi. It also doesn't show that God is literally incapable of revealing that you haven't ever gotten into a taxi. No, instead it only shows that in those worlds in which God reveals to someone that you've never got into a taxi, in those worlds you never get into a taxi. So you can't conclude that either of the individual conjuncts within this unsatisfiable pair, namely you getting into a taxi and God revealing that you've never gotten into a taxi, you can't conclude that either one of those conjuncts is impossible from the paradox. All that follows is that the conjunction of them is impossible. And similarly, with the Grim Reaper paradox, it's not the infinite past itself which engenders the contradiction. It is only when you combine an infinite past with infinitely many Reapers spanning that past, each of whom has some property if and only if none of the earlier ones have it. It is those conditions together which entail the contradiction. You're not licensed to conclude from that one of the conjuncts is impossible, that an infinite past is impossible. Now, again, someone can try to defend a linking premise in a manner similar to that described earlier, but my point here is simply that we can't conclude that infinite pasts or infinite causal chains are impossible simply from there being a paradox involving infinite pasts or infinite causal chains. People, especially non-philosophers, are far too hasty in conclusions that they draw from paradoxes like this, and they'll very often fail to even recognize the need for a linking premise, let alone offer good reason to accept such a premise. So, in summary of this 73rd problem, just because a paradox or inconsistent story or contradictory scenario involves infinity, that doesn't mean an infinity of the relevant sort is impossible. From the fact that one can tell an inconsistent story involving an eternal past, for instance, it simply doesn't follow that an eternal past is impossible. I can tell an inconsistent story involving taxis, but that doesn't mean taxis are impossible. All the paradox itself allows us to infer is that one cannot conjoin an eternal past together with various other assumptions. For example, that there is a particular collection of entities within that eternal past with very specific properties. But the fact that we cannot conjoin an eternal past with various other assumptions clearly doesn't mean that an eternal past is impossible, any more than the fact that we cannot conjoin God's existence with various other assumptions clearly doesn't imply that God is impossible. It implies only that we cannot jointly have an eternal past together with various other conditions holding. To avert this invalid inference, you'll need to roll up your sleeves, add a linking premise, address the difficulties afflicting that linking premise, and give us positive reasons to accept that premise. Things are, in other words, considerably more difficult than popular discussions of paradoxes in the context of the Kalam would let on. Alright, on to mistake number 74. From nothing, nothing comes as an alleged motivation for the Kalam's causal principle. This does not motivate the principle, and it's very painful every time I see it. So let's get to this timestamp in my video on the Kalam's causal principle. Now, as it happens, from nothing, nothing comes is actually ambiguous. It could be saying, like, from a state of nothing, there cannot emerge something that comes from that state of nothingness. It's not as though something can, like, emerge from a state of non-being. Non-being can't produce something. Well, sure, when you put it that way, the principle seems obviously true. It seems pretty innocuous. But then it's just utterly irrelevant to the Kalam's causal principle. Because in denying the Kalam's causal principle, one is not saying that a state of nothingness can, like, burp out something. They're not saying that a state of nothingness can produce something. Instead, when they deny the causal principle, they're saying that at least some things can begin without being caused to begin by anything. So it's not as though they're coming from a state of non-being or emerging from a state of non-being, or that they're being produced by non-being or nothingness. Rather, they're not being produced by anything. So denying the causal principle doesn't commit one to saying that there once was a state of nothingness, and then from that state of nothingness emerged something, or something like that. And nor does denying the causal principle imply that one must ascribe causal powers to nothingness. No. To deny the causal principle, you don't have to reify nothingness. You simply need to say that something can begin without being caused to begin by anything. You're not positively saying that something can be produced by non-being, or by a state of nothingness. Oh, actually, I anticipated myself, so I just wrote that next on the script. So, the ex nihilo nihil fit principle, which is this principle up here, from nothing, nothing comes, that means ex nihilo nihil fit. I probably pronounced that incorrectly, but that's okay. That principle is either irrelevant to KCP, or it's a mere restatement of it. So you can see this video here, which I'm going to take us through. When someone says that the universe began to exist without a cause, they're not saying, like, first there's non-being, and then there's some sort of, like, transition to being, and, like, being sort of, like, emerges from non-being, or, like, is burped out of non-being. That's not what someone is saying when they're denying the causal principle. So it's, like, it's just irrelevant to the causal principle in that sense. If that's how we're construing this principle, ex nihilo nihil fit, from nothing, nothing comes, or being doesn't come from non-being. So it's either irrelevant to the causal principle, or if it is supposed to be relevant to it, then it's just a restatement of it. You're just saying that something can't begin to exist without there being, like, a prior thing that brings it into existence, or some sort of causally prior thing that causes it. But in that case, it doesn't motivate the principle. That's just a restatement of the principle. So it's either relevant or it's just a restatement. So either way, it doesn't support it. And so this would also address the quote-unquote argument that I've seen some people offer for the Kalam's causal principle, according to which, nothing has no causal powers or potentialities. And so clearly something can't come from nothing, because nothing doesn't even have the potential to produce something, or it doesn't even have causal powers to produce something. But again, this is just committing that same mistake. It's reifying nothingness. It's committing the person who's denying the causal principle, just saying that, oh, nothingness does have causal power, or nothingness somehow possesses potentialities. But denying the causal principle does not require that. Denying the causal principle only requires saying that something can begin to exist without being caused by anything. You're not saying that there is such a thing as nothingness, and it has the causal power or potentiality to bring about something. That's not what someone is saying when they're denying the causal principle. So anyway. Alright, so that's mistake number 74, and I honestly don't have anything to add, so let's move on to mistake number 75. If everything has a cause, then what caused God as an objection to the Kalam? This one is especially painful. Certainly the Kalam's causal principle doesn't say that everything has a cause. It only says that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And of course, since God didn't begin to exist, this principle does not imply that God would need a cause. And more generally, no cosmological argument made by any serious thinker in the history of human thought has ever said that absolutely everything needs a cause, at least in the sense of an efficient cause. Not Aristotle, not Aquinas, not Avicenna, not Maimonides, not Leibniz, not Clarke, not Craig, not Proust, not Raphson, not a zilch, nil, zero, empty goose egg. Okay? So this certainly takes the cake as perhaps the worst possible objection to any cosmological argument. Onwards we march to mistake number 76, and that is ignoring non-causal explanations. So often in popular discussions about the Kalam, and even in the philosophical literature, people conflate being uncaused with being utterly inexplicable, with having no explanation. Or they think that having no cause implies having no explanation or being inexplicable. No, it doesn't. That assumes that the only source of explanations are causal explanations, but that is not true. There are non-causal explanations. Something may lack a cause and yet nevertheless have an explanation for why it occurred or why it exists or why it has some feature. So yeah, as I say here, just because something is uncaused, that doesn't mean it's unexplained or arbitrary or chaotic or random or what have you. More specifically, just because a beginning is uncaused, that doesn't mean that it's thereby unexplained or arbitrary or chaotic or random or anything like that. Craig, for instance, makes a mistake pretty similar to this mistake here. Craig says, first and foremost, the principle, that is the Kalam's causal principle, is rooted in the metaphysical intuition that something cannot come into being from nothing. For to come into existence without a cause of any sort is to come into being from nothing. To suggest that things could just pop into being uncaused out of nothing is to quit doing serious metaphysics and resort to magic. Nobody sincerely believes that things can just pop into being without a cause, etc. But the view that something can come into existence without a cause is simply not the view that something can come into existence from nothing, that is, from no explanatorily prior conditions whatsoever. And no, supposing something can come into existence without a cause is not to resort to magic, since there may be non-causal explanations for why something comes into existence. And of course, what has an explanation is clearly not like magical in the sense that Craig is trying to bring out, right? Magic is all about mystery, whereas explanations remove mystery and provide an account for why the phenomenon in question occurs. And of course, note too here that the onus is on Craig to show that there can be no such explanations in the case at hand, that is, no non-causal explanations of something's beginning to exist, even though it lacks a causal explanation, right? Since Craig is the one trying to convince us to accept the causal principle, and in doing so, he is the one who needs the claim that there can be no such explanations in the case at hand. Don't forget mistake number 45 that we covered in probably part 1. That's so speculative. Or undercutting versus rebutting defeaters. Okay, anyway, the same general problem of conflating causation and explanation, or thinking being uncaused implies being unexplained, that comes up lots of times in other domains, such as contingency arguments. Because of this, we're going to spend some time here explaining why this conflation is simply mistaken. There are boatloads of non-causal explanations, that is, explanations of things that don't cite causes. And here's just a small sampling of such explanations in the form of an incomplete and unrepresentative taxonomy. Again, my sole purpose here is just to give examples of non-causal explanations. Not all of these are cases in which, let's say, some concrete object begins to exist, and it has an explanation for its beginning to exist, and yet that explanation is not causal. That's not the sort of example that I'm trying to give here. The sort of example that I'm giving here is simply examples involving non-causal explanations of things, which illustrates that we cannot conflate causation and explanation in the way that many people do in this mistake. So let's get on to some such non-causal explanations. So a first kind of non-causal explanation, or class of explanations, are moral explanations. I mean, like, quite plausibly, part of the explanation for why shooting a bunch of innocent people is wrong is that doing so is an act of wanton cruelty. But being an act of wanton cruelty doesn't, like, causally bring about the actions being wrong. No, there's just a non-causal dependence of wrongness on certain other properties of actions. Similarly, part of the explanation for why torture is wrong is the immense suffering that the victim experiences. Right? If victims of torture didn't suffer at all, if instead they experienced bliss during it, then torture either wouldn't be bad at all or wouldn't be nearly as bad as it in fact is. But clearly the suffering doesn't causally burp out the wrongness of torture. It's not, we don't have a causal relation here. The suffering at least partly explains the wrongness of torture, but it doesn't causally bring about the wrongness of torture. In like fashion, part of the explanation for why it's morally permissible to pull the lever on the trolley case is that doing so results in 5 lives saved at the cost of only 1 life lost, but that fact doesn't somehow cause the moral permissibility of torture. Another class of non-causal explanations are purely mathematical explanations, so quite plausibly the Pythagorean theorem isn't some brute, utterly inexplicable fact. Plausibly it's explained by more fundamental axioms of Euclidean geometry, such as the parallel postulate, from which the Pythagorean theorem can be derived and which, taken together, remove mystery as to why the Pythagorean theorem is true. Kenny Pierce, in his debate book with Graham Oppy entitled Is There a God? A Debate, makes a similar point on pages 185 to 186. So Mark Lang discusses the following simple mathematical example of a non-causal mathematical explanation. Consider the number keys on a typical calculator arranged like this. We've got 789, 456, 123. Now, pick any row, column, or diagonal you like and hit the number keys first in one direction, then the other, to get a number like 789, 987, or 753, 357, and so forth. Every number typed this way is divisible by 37, which you can verify by playing with a calculator. Now, that's weird, and it seems quite mysterious, like the sort of thing that ought to have an explanation. And in fact, this phenomenon does have an explanation. The series of numbers in a row, column, or diagonal on a calculator has the form A plus D, A plus 2D. For instance, if we go across the top row, we set A equal to 7 and D equal to 1. If we go across the diagonal from the top left to the bottom right, we set A equal to 7 and D equal to negative 2, and so on. Now, we can express any number formed by this procedure as 10 to the 5 times A, plus 10 to the 4 times A plus D, plus 10 to the 3 times A plus 2D, and so on. If you factor out A and D and do a little bit more factoring, you get that this whole thing is equal to 1,221 times 91A plus 10D. It follows then that every such number is divisible by 1,221, which is in turn divisible by 37. Of course, this is a toy example that would not be of too much interest to mathematicians, but the crucial feature of the example is that we know that the claim is true before we know why it is true. And we have this explanation here which doesn't cite any causal factors whatsoever. And there are real examples in the history of mathematics in which someone proved that a certain theorem was true, but mathematicians thought it was still mysterious why that theorem is true. And because of cases like this, there is an increasing consensus among philosophers of mathematics and mathematicians that mathematical explanations exist. And of course, mathematical explanations are non-causal in nature. And this consensus is based on examination of the practice of mathematics. So that's another class of non-causal explanations. A still further class of non-causal explanations consists in mathematical or structural explanations of features of concrete reality. So here's a cookie example from my book Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs, published with Springer in 2023, co-authored with Dr. Daniel J. Linford. I highly recommend checking it out, of course. Links in the description. Yes, indeed. So suppose that Stephen Woodford, is hanging out with 2 friends, Cameron Bertuzzi, and Joe, that is me. Suppose Stephen has 23 cookies and wants to give each of his 2 friends the same whole number of cookies without any left over. To Stephen's dismay, he finds that he can't do this. And what explains the fact that Stephen's desire has the property of being frustrated? Well, the explanation is in terms of mathematical constraints. 23 cannot be divided by 2 to yield a whole number. Importantly, though, this is not a causal explanation, right? The relevant non-divisibility of 23 isn't causing Stephen's desire to be frustrated. Nevertheless, it explains the frustration of Stephen's desire. And indeed, this is the only explanation of why the desire is frustrated, right? We're not asking why Stephen exists or why his desire exists or whatever. We're asking why the relevant desire is frustrated, given that he exists, given these background conditions. And this is a point more generally recognized in the literature about non-causal explanations. Nevin Klimenhagen and Daniel Rubio give the example of the pigeonhole principle and losing a bet. The pigeonhole principle, I actually recommend watching this super cool video about the pigeonhole principle. It actually has an explanatory application insofar as it figures crucially into a non-causal explanation of the number of humans who share the same number of hairs in their bodies at any given time. Super fascinating. Anyway, suppose that I bet someone that I could find 8 people, each of whom was born on a different day of the week than the rest. Well, I'm guaranteed to fail. What explains that? What explains the fact that I'm guaranteed to fail? Well, it's the pigeonhole principle utilized in mathematics. The basic idea is that there are only 7 possible slots here, corresponding to the 7 days of the week. And so if I have 8 things to fill in those slots, There's no way to do that without at least one of the things that I'm populating the slots with to be doubled up with another such thing. This is a perfectly adequate explanation of why I'm going to lose my bet. But we haven't cited any cause. Instead, we've cited certain mathematical facts, in particular the pigeonhole principle, and certain facts about the failure of one-to-one correspondence between two collections. Also falling into this class of non-causal explanations are some that philosopher Peter Lipton has pointed out. In particular, Lipton notes that not every scientific explanation is causal. Science also explains phenomena in geometrical terms, or by non-causal statistical principles, such as regression to the mean. Here's an example. Throw a bunch of sticks in the air, and take a snapshot of the sticks as they fall. In the snapshot, more of the sticks will be near the horizontal axis than the vertical axis. Why is this? Well, there's a simple non-causal explanation of this phenomenon. There are two horizontal axes and only one vertical axis. And a geometrical consequence of this is that there are indefinitely many horizontal orientations, but only two vertical orientations. Mark Collivan also gives lots of examples of non-causal explanations of antipodal weather patterns. In his book on the indispensability of mathematics, on page 49, we're not going to get into that here. But anyway, my point is just that this is yet another class of non-causal explanations, namely mathematical or structural explanations of features of concrete reality. Right, thus far, certain types of non-causal explanations that we've been going through are moral explanations, purely mathematical explanations, mathematical or structural explanations of features of concrete reality. Next up is grounding style explanations. So grounding is that relation whereby more fundamental things give rise to less fundamental things. It's also known as metaphysical explanation, and involves a kind of synchronic, or at one time, right? Synchronos, at one time. It involves a kind of synchronic dependence between different levels of reality, or different layers of reality. That is, a dependence at a single time, or else timelessly, in the case of abstract objects, wherein the more fundamental things or facts determine, or make, or build up the less fundamental things or facts, and where the less fundamental things or facts obtain in virtue of the more fundamental things or facts. So here's an example of a non-causal grounding style explanation involving labor strike and picketing. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on metaphysical grounding. The truck drivers are engaged in a labor strike in virtue of picketing. Now, what sort of claim is this? Well, it seems clear what the sort of claim it isn't. It isn't an identity claim. For example, the property of striking isn't identical to the property of picketing, as there are different ways of striking, such as carefully following all safety regulations so as to impede productivity. It isn't a causal claim either, at least if by causation we mean what we normally mean when we use the term. Right, the causes of the strike concern not the picketing of the truckers, but instead antecedent events, such as how their employer has allotted payroll deductions and benefits. So we have one thing obtaining in virtue of some more fundamental thing, but the more fundamental thing isn't like causally producing the less fundamental thing. And this is a general trend in cases of grounding. Right, here's another example. Reality explains truth. Consider what Aristotle writes in his Metaphysics. When is what is called truth or falsity present, and when is it not? Well, we must consider what we mean by these terms. It is not because we think that you are white, that you are white. But instead, because you are white, we who say this have the truth, right? So that sounds a little bit odd. But what he's saying, right, he's just endorsing a general point that's basically uncontroversial in philosophy. A claim or statement or belief or proposition is true because things are how that claim or statement represents things as being, right? And not the other way around. It's precisely because, say, grass is green, that my statement, grass is green, that I just said right here, it's precisely because grass is in fact green. It's precisely because reality is such that grass is green that my statement there is true. So Aristotle is really just recognizing that what is true depends on what the world is like, not vice versa. As Trenton Merricks writes, despite the many controversies surrounding truth, it should be uncontroversial that a claim, if true, is true because the world is the way that the claim represents the world as being, and not vice versa. Again, it should be uncontroversial that there are no white ravens is true because there are no white ravens. But, I mean, clearly, right, the absence of white ravens isn't something that's like causally producing the truth of the relevant statement or proposition, right? So notice, we have here a case of explanation without causation. Similarly, grass is being green, while explaining the truth of the statement, grass is green, is not plausibly taken to be a cause of that statement's truth. Instead, we have a non-causal form of explanatory dependence here. Or maybe it's grounding, maybe it's a unique relation of truth-making, maybe it's something else entirely, but whatever it is, it's plausibly both explanatory and non-causal. Here are two more examples of non-causal grounding-style explanations. One is the value of money. Right? Plausibly, the value of money is grounded in our collective attitudes and practices. But it's not like our attitudes causally produce the value of money. It's just that its value is constituted by and explained in terms of our collective attitudes and practices. So again, explanation without causation. Similarly, lots of philosophers think that sets depend for their existence and identity on the existence and identity of their members, right? Like lots of philosophers think that it's precisely because I exist and am distinguished from other people that my singleton set, the set containing Joe, exists and is distinguished from other singleton sets containing other people, right? So like members of a set are more fundamental than and explain the sets that contain them. But it's not very plausible to say that I'm like causally bringing about, like causally producing my singleton set, and so on. So that's another class of non-causal explanations. There are also explanations that appeal to essentialist facts, like explanations of why something has some property that cite simply what it is to be that thing. Like what it is to be that thing is to have that property, and that explains why it has the relevant property. You can see John Bankson, Terence Cuneo, and Russ Schaefer Landau's The Source of Normativity for more on this sort of explanation and why it is indeed explanatorily illuminating, but of course it's not a causal sort of explanation. So again, a class of non-causal explanations there. A still further class of non-causal explanations derived from functional realization. So on some functionalist views in the philosophy of mind, mental properties are realized by certain underlying physical structures implementing certain patterns or rules or functions. Now, while the various physical structures are causally interacting with one another, the explanatory relation between the mental properties and the underlying function implementing physical properties is one of realization, not causation. Again, at least under certain functionalist views in the philosophy of mind. The point isn't that these views are correct, but only that they illustrate a perfectly respectable non-causal explanatory relation, namely functional realization. Alright, a still further class of non-causal explanations appeal to the explanatory power of necessity, or the impossibility of the contrary. Take the Bridges of Königsberg case. So in Königsberg, I think that, what was that, a town in like Prussia or something, way back when Kant lived or something? Sorry, I know very little about history. So anyway, back in my day, back in Königsberg, there were once 7 bridges connecting a series of islands like below. This is actually like the kind of structure that they took on. Now consider Bridget trying to cross all 7 bridges of Königsberg without crossing any bridge twice. So she's trying to cross all 7 bridges of Königsberg without doubling back on herself. So, crap, she's going to have to double back on herself to cross 3. As is well known, Euler provided a proof in 1735 that she cannot succeed. Now, in any given instance, it might be that her failure to do so involves her like accidentally doubling back on herself, or maybe slipping on a banana skin and into the water, etc. But if we want to know why she is doomed to fail, rather than what happens on a given attempt, the explanation is not in terms of like banana skins or any other causal factors, but instead in the non-causal terms of graph theory. Right? If we treat each of the 7 bridges as an edge and each of the landmasses as vertices, the 7 bridges can be treated as a connected graph. The resulting graph is non-Eulerian, which means that it provably lacks an Eulerian path, which is just a continuous path through a graph that passes over each edge exactly once. This lack of Eulerian paths explains why she is doomed to fail. There just is no successful crossing available to her, so she must fail. Sam Barron and Mark Collivan in a 2019 paper developed this case and give lots of other citations to lots of other cases and lots of citations to the literature on non-causal explanations. Of course, this sort of non-causal explanation of her failure to cross the 7 bridges without doubling back on herself probably overlaps with the earlier category that I covered of structural or mathematical explanations of features of concrete reality, so there is that. But anyway, another kind of explanation by appeal to necessity, or the impossibility of the contrary, which is not a causal explanation, is God's existence, right? Many theists will offer an explanation of God's existence in terms of the impossibility of God's non-existence, right? Why does God exist? Well, because he couldn't have failed to exist. He's a necessary being. We here have an explanation for why God exists in terms of the impossibility of the contrary. That is, the impossibility of God's non-existence, rather than in terms of a causal explanation. You know, theists don't want to say that something caused God, but many of them still want to say that God's existence has an explanation. So many theists themselves are committed to non-causal explanations. Here's another example of the non-causal explanations which appeal to necessity, or the impossibility of the contrary. As I explained in my video on the Kalam's causal principle in the section on the argument from chaos, defenders of cosmological arguments, especially the Kalam cosmological argument, often appeal to the explanatory power of necessity, or equivalently, impossibility, right? Like the two are interdefinable, right? In any case wherein the necessity of P is adduced to explain P, one could equally adduce the impossibility of P's being false to explain P. But anyway, my point here is just that defenders of cosmological arguments, especially the Kalam, often appeal to the explanatory power of necessity to explain, or the explanatory power of the impossibility of the contrary to explain. And these are non-causal explanations. So for instance, such defenders will often argue that the reason, the explanation for why uncaused chaos doesn't pervade reality is that such is simply impossible. They often do this by appeal to metaphysical principles, not by appeal to causes. Another class of non-causal explanation are identity explanations. So lots of times we can explain things by appeal to identity rather than by appeal to, like, causes. The mind-to-brain identity theory, for instance, provides a good explanation of the one-to-one correlation between instances of mental properties and instances of some physical properties. Namely, that the properties are identical, right? That's an explanation. If mental properties are identical with the relevant physical properties, then there's no mystery as to why they're going to correlate, right? So we can explain the very tight, intimate connections between mental states and brain states by saying that they're identical. I'm not saying that this is true. My point is just that if identity theory were true, it would obviously provide a satisfying explanation of the intimate correlations between mental states and brain states. That's the point, and you don't have to be an identity theorist, as I'm not, to recognize that. So the properties being identical explains various empirical one-to-one correlations that we've noticed between instances of mental properties and instances of certain physical properties. But of course, their identity clearly doesn't, like, causally produce their correlation, right? It explains it, but it doesn't cause it. Similarly, the best explanation of why the Cincinnati Strangler's victims were invariably past girlfriends of Fred Jones is that the Cincinnati Strangler and Fred Jones are the same person. Again, the numerical identity between the Cincinnati Strangler and Fred Jones clearly isn't something that causes the victims of the Cincinnati Strangler to be like past girlfriends of Fred Jones. So identity explanations afford abundant examples of non-causal explanations. Further examples of non-causal explanations come from theology, right? Quite plausibly, Christian theists who adopt orthodox views of the Trinity as opposed to heterodox views must commit to non-causal explanations. Under such orthodox views, the Son is generated by the Father, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father, and perhaps also the Son, which means that the Son and Spirit are in some manner explained by the Father. And yet surely the Son and Spirit aren't, like, caused to exist. They aren't, like, brought into being by some cause, right? Then they'd be created things. So Christians specifically are committed to there being non-causal explanations. There are also lots of explanations that appeal to abstracta. So for instance, in science, there are thousands of articles and books about how abstracta explain the character of ordinary particulars and the success of certain enterprises like science. You can see my video with Scott Berman, wherein he argues that abstracta explain various features of science. Again, even if you deny the existence of abstracta altogether, the point here is just that these explanations cite facts that would, if they were true, they'd remove mystery as to why the explanandum obtains, and hence would offer a non-causal explanation. Abstracta also could arguably explain character agreement. So universals are often adduced to explain the character of ordinary particulars, as well as why various numerically distinct particulars objectively resemble one another, like why my coat and your coat and my laptop are all black, let's say. For instance, a universal is supposed to be one thing that is shared in common among numerically distinct particulars. There is therefore no difficulty in seeing how this explains objective resemblance, right? Things resemble because they literally share one and the same thing in common among themselves. Like, for example, they resemble one another in respect of color, partly because they share numerically one color property. I mean, once more, sharing numerically one property in common isn't something which is plausibly taken to be a cause of their shared character, but it does nevertheless explain it. Moreover, abstracta have often been appealed to explain shared content, right? One of the central motivations for believing in abstract propositions is that we can only explain how we're able to communicate with one another by appeal to abstract propositions as a central component within that explanation, since only such propositions provide shared, non-linguistic or extra-linguistic semantic content for our utterances and inscriptions. Boatloads of non-causal explanations are discussed and explored in countless works by professional philosophers, and it's relatively uncontroversial that there are non-causal explanations. I genuinely could have given dozens upon dozens more. So, for example, this is just from one of Megan Fritz's papers in Synthes. Structural explanations, narrative explanations, teleological or functional explanations, equilibrium explanations, mathematical explanations, etc. And anyway, for a small, I truly mean this is a small sampling of further discussions and examples of non-causal explanation. You can see the following resources by Mark Collivan, Peter Lipton, Baker, Leon, Lang, Barron, Rice, Pincock, Swenson, etc., Weitlinger, Kleiman-Haga, Pierce, SCP, etc. And of course, this is a reminder that patrons have access to literally all the documents that I make for videos, including the 7-part series, including this document that you're looking at here. They have access to all the scripts for all of my past videos, for which I've made scripts. They have access to channel preparation, to exclusive videos, to bonus content, all that stuff. So much love to my current patrons. If you see value in the work that I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. Any amount helps, truly. Thank you so much. Okay, moving on. So to just sum up, do not ignore non-causal explanation in the context of the Kalam. And always be on guard when someone tries to infer that something must be unexplained or arbitrary or chaotic or random or inexplicable simply because it lacks a cause. That is a mistake. That doesn't follow. Because there still may very well be a non-causal explanation, and anyone who wants to say that because something is uncaused, it's thereby unexplained or arbitrary or whatever, they need to say why there couldn't be a non-causal explanation for the relevant uncaused thing. Again, if they want to infer from something being uncaused to it being unexplained or arbitrary or chaotic or random. And as a reminder, I went through boatloads of kinds of non-causal explanations. And even within these kinds, there are various different instances or subtypes. So we went through moral explanations, purely mathematical explanations of like other mathematical facts, mathematical or structural explanations of features of concrete reality, grounding style explanations, explanations by appeal to essential facts, like what it is to be something, explanations that appeal to functional realization, explanations that appeal to necessity or the impossibility of the contrary, explanations that appeal to identity, theological explanations, abstracta explanations, and so on. So shout it from the rooftops, scream it from the pulpit, don't ignore non-causal explanations. Alright, mistake number 77, the Kalam commits the fallacy of composition. No, it doesn't, okay? It just doesn't. Stop. Defenders of the Kalam's first premise, according to which whatever begins to exist has a cause, are not arguing that because everything within the universe has a cause, therefore the universe as a whole must have a cause. Instead, they're employing an inductive generalization. Every observed beginning has a cause, and so probably every beginning has a cause. This is a perfectly kosher form of inference. It's justifiably employed in science, philosophy, and ordinary life. And notice that we aren't inferring that a whole has some property simply because each of its parts have some property. Instead, we're inductively generalizing from observed cases to unobserved cases. Of course, you could try to argue that our observed sample is unrepresentative of the broader class over which Kalam proponents wish to generalize, or that there's a relevant difference between the observed cases and the unobserved cases over which Kalam proponents want to generalize, which defeats the inductive generalization. But notice then that you're simply granting that the problem here isn't with inferring that a whole has a property simply because the parts of that whole have that property. Instead, the problem lies elsewhere, and the composition fallacy accusation dissipates. Those dirty capitalists and their fallacies.
Alright, mistake number 78. The Kalam equivocates on the word cause.
No, it doesn't, as William Lane Craig nicely explains here.
In the first premise, cause means material cause, while in the conclusion, it does not. Response to objection number 3. This objection raises the question of what it means to commit the fallacy of equivocation. This fallacy is using a word in the same context with two different meanings. Now, in formulating the Kalam cosmological argument, I intended to speak of what Aristotle called efficient causes. An efficient cause is what brings an effect into being, what produces an effect in existence, while a material cause is the stuff out of which the thing is made. My claim was that whatever begins to exist has an efficient cause, and therefore the universe, having begun to exist, must have an efficient cause. The charge of equivocation immediately evaporates.
Of course, there may still be worries for the Kalam arising from material causation. For instance, there are arguments parallel to the Kalam and which arguably should be accepted if the Kalam should be accepted, which concern material causation. For instance, that every concrete material object that begins to exist has a material cause. The universe is a concrete material object which began to exist, which Kalam proponents think, and so it must have a material cause. But if traditional theism is true, the universe does not have material cause, so traditional theism is false. That sort of criticism. But that's different from saying that the Kalam itself, or Kalam proponents, make the elementary mistake of equivocating on the meaning of a term. So please stop saying that the Kalam equivocates on the word cause. No, it doesn't. Alright, on to mistake number 79, saying that, well, nothing ever begins to exist, while also not being willing to accept Mariological nihilism, which is arguably a consequence of that statement. If you want to make this sort of criticism that many internet atheists are wont to make, that nothing ever begins to exist, then they need to be willing to accept Mariological nihilism. So let's get into the William Lane Craig video that we just watched.
Objection number 6. Nothing ever begins to exist, for the material of which a thing consists precedes it. So it is not true that the universe began to exist. the assertion that nothing ever begins to exist is so patently ridiculous. Did I exist before I was conceived? If so, where was I? What was I doing during the Jurassic period? Has the World Trade Center always existed? If so, why didn't the Native American Indians notice it? This objection obviously confuses a thing with the matter or stuff of which the thing is made. Just because the stuff of which something was made has always existed doesn't imply that the thing itself has always existed. Now, since writing this talk, it has occurred to me that the objector could save himself from the embarrassment of affirming that he has always existed by adopting what's called mereological nihilism, which is the view that there are no composite objects. That is to say, all that exists are just fundamental particles which are arranged in various ways. So in fact, there really are no chairs or tables or horses or people or palm trees. There are just fundamental particles which are arranged chair-wise or table-wise or people-wise. And so in denying that he ever began to exist, the objector isn't affirming that he's always existed. Rather, what he's denying is that he ever does exist.
Now, don't get me wrong, I think William Lane Craig starts to fall into another mistake in the rest of the video after the clip that I played there, namely dismissing mereological nihilism on very flimsy grounds, even though it's quite a respectable view in metaphysics. My point is simply that it's a mistake to simultaneously say that nothing ever begins to exist, while also not being willing to embrace mereological nihilism with its attendant costs and benefits. It's not cost-free, it's a significant commitment, and many people aren't willing to accept it. Alright, mistake number 80, claiming that the cause of the universe must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, enormously powerful, and personal. Or at least what's mistaken here are typical defenses of these claims. As I say here, this is not true, or at least it's not adequately supported. You can see my video with Dr. Daniel Linford, wherein we explain, near the end, why almost none of these follow, or my video from Kalam to God. But in short, from the fact that something caused our universe, all that follows is that it doesn't exist within the spatiotemporal framework of our universe. But there may very well be a spatial framework that is different from that of our universe, and in which the cause of our specific universe resides, assuming of course that our universe began to exist and has a cause. Timelessness also doesn't follow, since the cause may exist in a non-metric time prior to the beginning of the metric time associated with our physical universe. More on that notion later in this video. As for immateriality, it's not exactly clear to me what immateriality means, precisely because it's not exactly clear to me what exactly it is to be material, but we can at least say that the cause being non-physical doesn't follow, even if the cause being non-spatiotemporal does follow. And again, I've already explained why being non-spatiotemporal doesn't follow. And the reason that non-physical doesn't follow, even if we grant non-spatiotemporality, is that there are perfectly respectable cosmological models which feature non-spatiotemporal physical things. Again, see my discussion with Dr. Daniel Linford for more on this. Or see his dissertation. You can freely read it on Phil Papers. It's called, Cosmic Skepticism in the Beginning of the Universe. Or see, I think it's section 8.3 in our book, Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs, where we talk about wave function monism, etc. Anyway, enormously powerful doesn't follow, since the only power we're licensed to infer the cause has is the power of kickstarting the series of events in the early stages of our universe. And we already know that small, not enormously powerful causes can have huge, powerful effects. And personal also plausibly doesn't follow for reasons spelled out in my video from Kalam to God, and for more reasons besides, but I'm only giving here a super rough informal gloss. Again, see those resources I mentioned for further explication and justification. All of them are in the resource document linked in the description. Okay, that's mistake number 80. On to mistake number 81. Science, or the Big Bang, proves that the universe began to exist. No, it doesn't. Again, see my video with Dr. Daniel Linford. And also see the 2 other videos in my Kalam playlist responding to the scientific case for the Kalam second premise. At best, science only shows that our local spatiotemporal manifold began to expand from a very condensed state about 13.8 billion years ago. That doesn't at all mean that our spatiotemporal manifold began to exist 13.8 billion years ago, and nor does it mean that all of space-time reality, let alone all of physical reality, began to exist 13.8 billion years ago. We repeatedly point out in the video up here that science itself can only, at best, show that our local spatiotemporal manifold is past finite. But this is entirely insufficient for showing that the totality of all physical reality began to exist. Since A, some physical reality might have pre-existed the beginning of metric time within a state of non-metric time, B, some physical reality might have existed timelessly sans metric time, but temporally since, which is just a modification of Craig's view of God as applied to some physical reality, C, some physical reality might have a timeless aspect in the sense that while it's non-fundamentally temporal, it's fundamentally timeless, and it would have existed even if time hadn't, and D, some physical reality might be timeless simpliciter, as many physicists and philosophers of physics take the universal wave function to be. Nothing in science shows that all of A through D hold. Science then doesn't show that the totality of all physical reality began to exist. Stop claiming that it does. Again, for more on all this, see the aforementioned videos. And this, of course, bridges us very nicely into mistake number 82, which is the illicit slide from finite past to the universe began to exist. Or thinking that the past being finite implies that the universe began to exist. It does not, and you cannot infer that the universe began to exist merely from the fact that the past is finite. As Craig himself recognizes, we cannot conclude that something begins to exist merely from the fact that its past is finite. For Craig thinks that God's past is finite, and yet God didn't begin to exist, right? Otherwise God would require a cause in Craig's view. Craig thinks God's past is finite because Craig thinks God exists in time since the moment of creation, and there has only been, on Craig's view, a finite amount of past time during which God has existed. So then, having a finite past is not enough for beginning to exist, and the reason for this, in the case of Craig's view of God, is that God existed timelessly sans creation, or timelessly without and causally prior to the creation of metric time. So then, in Craig's view, God doesn't begin to exist at the beginning of metric time. Instead, God merely begins to be temporal, as it were. He doesn't arrive anew onto the scene of reality. So then, one way for something to have a finite past and yet fail to begin to exist is if it, or some portion of it, exists timelessly sans its temporal life. And there are other ways, too, in principle, for something to fail to begin to exist while nevertheless having a finite past. For instance, something could pre-exist the beginning of metric time in a non-metric or amorphous time, which is a temporal state for which there is no objective fact of the matter concerning its length or duration. This view has been proposed by Richard Swinburne, Ryan Mullins, and Alan Paget. In the case of God, it's their view. It's called the Oxford School of Divine Temporality. And there being non-metric time has also been proposed for portions of cosmological history under Roger Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmology. Once more, if something pre-exists the beginning of metric time in a beginningless but not infinitely long non-metric time, right? It's beginningless but not infinitely long because there's no objective fact of the matter concerning its duration, right? So it's not true that it began to exist finitely long ago, but it's also not true that it has lasted infinitely long. Both of those would involve there being some objective fact of the matter concerning its duration. But since it's non-metric, there isn't such a fact of the matter. So, once more, if something pre-exists the beginning of metric time in a beginningless but not infinitely long non-metric time, then even if its past is finite, it doesn't arrive anew onto the scene of reality at its first moment of metric time, and so it doesn't truly begin to exist then. And Craig himself seems to agree that this view wouldn't imply that the entity pre-existing metric time in a non-metric time begins to exist, since Craig himself has said in his discussion with Ryan Mullins on my channel that he thinks this is a theologically legitimate view for someone to hold in the case of God, which he wouldn't think if he thought it implied that such an entity began to exist, where by such an entity I mean an entity which pre-exists metric time in a state of non-metric time. And there are still other ways too for something to fail to begin to exist even though its past is finite. For instance, it may have a timeless aspect in Dr. Linford's sense, which we talk about in our discussion, linked above and linked here, and which he discusses in his excellent paper, A Modal Condition for the Beginning of the Universe. Finally, the totality of physical reality may fail to begin to exist, even though its past is finite, if there's a timeless physical reality in addition to temporal physical realities whose past is collectively finite. In such a case, physical reality would be finite towards the past, even though it isn't true that the entirety or totality of physical reality began to exist, since at least one thing within that totality is timeless and so cannot begin to exist. I go through all these points and more in these videos here. So then, here are 4 ways, at least in principle, in which the universe, understood as the totality of physical reality, can have a finite past, even though it did not begin to exist. First, some physical entity may exist timelessly sans metric time, but temporally since the beginning of metric time. Secondly, some physical entity may have pre-existed the beginning of metric time in a beginningless but not infinitely long state of non-metric time. Third, some physical entity might have a timeless aspect, in the sense that while the entity is non-fundamentally temporal, it's fundamentally timeless, and it would have existed even if time hadn't existed. That's where I cited Linford's work above. And fourth, some physical reality might be timeless simpliciter, full stop, as many physicists and philosophers of physics take the universal wave function to be. So then, it is a mistake to swiftly infer that the universe began to exist merely from the fact that the past is finite. To infer that, you'd have to rule out each of 1, 2, 3, and 4. Always keep this in mind when someone tries to justify the second premise of the Kalam, according to which the universe began to exist, by arguments that would, if successful, only show that the past is finite. And by the way, that's like almost every single argument for the second premise of the Kalam, so this is a massive problem for the Kalam more generally. In short, the universe's beginning doesn't actually follow from the finitude of the past, and you should be on your guard to spot this illicit shift whenever it arises. And for more on non-metric time, you can see these resources here: Richard Swinburne's 1993 article, God and Time, Alan Paget's 1992 book, God, Eternity, and the Nature of Time, Ryan Mullins' forthcoming book, From Divine Timemaker to Divine Watchmaker, numerous of Mullins' articles available on his website, popular presentations in various videos of mine that I've done with Ryan Mullins himself, Penrose's Conformal Cyclic Cosmology, etc. So, then, to summarize this 80-second mistake, I'm just going to enjoin you to please stop saying that past finitude is sufficient for beginning to exist, and please stop thinking that showing that the universe is past finite is sufficient for showing that the universe began to exist. Just because something is finite towards the past doesn't mean that it began to exist. And again, all this means that arguments for the finitude of the past don't actually show the second premise of the Kalam, right? They don't actually show that the universe began to exist. One would also need to show that neither the universe nor any physical object whatsoever could exist timelessly sans the beginning of metric time, and nor could they have a timeless aspect in Linford's sense, and nor could they pre-exist the beginning of metric time in a non-metric time. And furthermore, nor could any physical object just be timeless simpliciter. As far as I'm aware, no proponent of the Kalam has even undertaken the task of giving sufficient reasons to rule out each and every one of these, let alone accomplished such a feat. Having summarized mistake number 82, let's move on to mistake number 83. The endless future is a potential infinite. No, it isn't. As the Kalam literature understands an actual infinite, it's simply a collection with infinitely many members, minimally Aleph Null many members, that is, enough members to be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. But of course, if the future is endless, then the collection of future, say, days can easily be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, right? Simply pair tomorrow with 1, the next day with 2, the following day with 3, the following day with 4, the following day with 5, and so on for each day of the endless future. Because the future is endless, we're not going to run out of future days to pair with the natural numbers, and hence the collection of future days can be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. Since that's just what it means in the Kalam literature to be an actual infinite, an endless future is an actual infinite. Note that no one is saying here that there will ever come a time in the future at which infinitely many days between now and then have elapsed, right? No one is saying that. Instead, we're simply talking about the number of days later than today. No one is saying that there will ever come a point at which someone can successfully say that they've traversed all the infinitely many days throughout the entirety of the endless future. No one is saying that. The point is just that if we focus on the number of days that there are within that entirety of the endless future, it's modeled by the positive x-axis. And how many units are there on the positive x-axis? It's clearly infinitely many, Aleph Null. So the collection of future days, whether or not it exists, is an actual infinite because it has infinitely many members. Right. Similarly, Craig thinks the past doesn't exist, but we can still talk about the number of members within the collection of past days, and it's going to be Aleph Null, even though those days don't exist on Craig's view. Now, as I say here, note that being an actual infinite doesn't require having members all of which exist, right? Otherwise, Craig couldn't consistently claim that a beginningless past is an actual infinite, since the members of that collection also don't all exist on Craig's view. Anyway, I'm not here to retrace the painstakingly detailed steps that I've already traced in this regard. You can see 3 videos wherein I explain and justify all of this in much greater depth. First, my Hilbert's Hotel, a comprehensive response. Secondly, this video that I did with Guarded Acumen, going over my Perslogian post. Third, my New Objections to the Kalam Still Work video. And of course, my Perslogian article here. I highly recommend checking this out. It gives very formal, rigorous, precise arguments for why an endless future is an actual infinite. And even lots of people who previously hadn't recognized this point are coming to recognize this. For instance, Trent Horn has recently come to see that, yeah, an endless future is an actual infinite, despite in the past arguing otherwise, but since Trent has looked into this stuff further, he's seen, oh yeah, actually it is an actual infinite. And that's a trend that I've seen more generally. So that's mistake number 83. On to mistake number 84, ignoring that stage 2 of the Kalam even exists. So, sometimes non-theists, when confronted with the Kalam, will simply ignore that stage 2 of the Kalam even exists. By the way, in mounting stage 2, proponents of the Kalam are basically just attempting to infer various divine attributes of the universe's cause. But we should all be aware that stage 2 does exist, and it can't simply be ignored. Right, this happens when some non-theists say that the Kalam just isn't even an argument for God's existence. I mean, sure, stage 1 of the Kalam isn't by itself an argument for God's existence. Okay, but nearly every defender of the Kalam has mounted a stage 2 case in trying to tease out why the universe's cause is, in their view, plausibly God or godlike. Now, of course, that case doesn't at all succeed, right? I mean, see what I've just said earlier, as well as my video with Dan Linford, etc. But my point here is just that the case can't simply be ignored. And you're really missing a significant part of the Kalam dialectic if you think it's not an argument for God's existence. Like, that's just mistaken, because stage 2 exists, and like literally every proponent of the Kalam goes on to mount a stage 2 case as part of their broader defense of the Kalam. Granted, someone might simply be using the word Kalam to refer only to stage 1. Okay, and in that case, it's true that there is no stage 2 of the Kalam, if that's how you're using the term Kalam. But of course, we needn't use the word that way, and it's not how many defenders of the Kalam use it. And besides, this is just semantics. My substantive point is that stage 2, as I've articulated it up here, stage 2 cannot be ignored. And so many non-theists just simply ignore it. Alright, mistake number 85, merely asserting that there can't be an infinite past because today would never arrive. And notice that I emphasize here merely asserting. I'm not saying that anyone who makes this claim is thereby making just like a clear mistake that should be pointed out in a common mistakes series. Instead, what I'm saying is a mistake, and a clear mistake, and a common mistake in my experience, is people just like merely asserting that there can't be an infinite past because today would never arrive. That is what I'm saying here is a common mistake that should really be avoided. See, as I say here, this common mistake consists in merely asserting instead of justifying the claim that if the past is infinite, today would never arrive. To be clear, I'm not claiming that there are no ways to justify this claim. My point is simply that so often people just flatly assert this claim without offering any reason whatsoever on its behalf. And it definitely needs some reason or justification, since to many people, myself included, it's nowhere near obvious. And note also that this style of argument has been responded to by lots of professional philosophers. See, for example, Felipe Leon's article here, Wes Morriston's article here, a number of other articles by Wes Morriston, and 2 videos I've done here on the successive addition argument. Of course, a few additional notes about the argument in particular. First, the argument, as Craig himself recognizes, seems to presuppose the A theory of time, at least in its Craigian manifestation, which of course is deeply controversial and actually a minority view among philosophers and physicists compared to the B theory of time. And there are lots of at least potentially worrying objections to the A theory deriving from truth-making, special relativity, and the relativity of simultaneity, general relativity treating space-time as a four-dimensional manifold, etc. None of these are decisive, of course, but they're considerations that people should be aware of. And second, even if we granted, as I don't think that we should, that the past is finite, it doesn't follow that the universe began to exist, as we saw in response to a previous common mistake. So those are just 2 further additional comments that I want to make on this sort of argument. But anyway, the main mistake here that I want to draw attention to is that so often, especially on the internet, people merely assert that, oh, hey, there can't be an infinite past because today would never arrive. All right, mistake number 86. Lawrence Krauss showed that the universe could have come from nothing. Oh boy, no, he didn't. He appealed to an already existent pre-given quantum vacuum from which the universe arose, which is clearly not nothing. Mistake number 87. Wood's painful tweet, or X, or whatever you call them. Theists believe in an uncaused cause. Atheists believe in an uncaused effect. The former belief may involve a mystery, but the latter requires incoherent nonsense and extreme gullibility. Don't be a skeptic clown. He literally has a PhD in philosophy. It's criminal. And it's so popular. Why is it so popular? Oh, I'm in pain. In any case, atheists aren't committed to believing in an uncaused effect. I mean, for starters, that doesn't make any sense, right? An effect, by definition, is something produced by a cause, right? Atheists obviously aren't committed to thinking that something both was and was not produced by a cause. But charitably, and not that charity is something that Wood is interested in, but set that aside, charitably, I think Wood means to say that atheists believe in an uncaused event, like the beginning of the universe, say. But he is cosmically mistaken here for several reasons. First, atheists, qua atheists, are not committed to thinking that the universe even had a beginning, right? An atheist can easily think that the totality of all physical reality is, for example, past infinite, even if our local spatiotemporal manifold that we inhabit is past finite. In that case, the atheist needn't posit any uncaused events. Each event can have a cause in terms of a prior event. It is simply false, then, that atheists are committed to an uncaused event. So he is just wrong, and cosmically so. Secondly, even if the atheist thinks that the universe began to exist, they need not say that the universe's beginning has no cause. They can perfectly easily say that the universe has a beginningless cause, thus avoiding any uncaused events, but that its cause simply isn't God. Right? The cause of our spatiotemporal manifold could be a special quantum field existing outside our manifold, for example, an inflaton field, or a non-spatiotemporal universal wave function, or the Tao, or Brahman impersonally conceived, or an atheistically conceived Thomistic being itself, or the Neoplatonic One impersonally conceived, or some special particle with an exotic state space outside of our universe, etc., etc., etc. Don't worry, we're going to be getting into this next. But my point here is just that it's false. It's clearly false to say that atheists believe in an uncaused event. The atheist need not regard the event of our universe's beginning, assuming it had a beginning, as uncaused. Third, Wood is confusing what someone believes with what he thinks their view implies, right? Even if Wood thinks atheism implies the existence of an uncaused event, say because Wood thinks that the universe began to exist, and that somehow only God could cause such a beginning, clearly, atheists are not committed to those claims which Wood thinks are true, and which would imply, together with atheism, that there was an uncaused event. Even if atheism implies an uncaused event together with Wood's tendentious beliefs that the atheist need not accept, it's just false to say that atheists believe in uncaused events. Wood has confused atheism implying an uncaused beginning, given Wood's commitment to the success of stages 1 and 2 of the Kalam. He's confused that with atheists believing in an uncaused beginning. All right, mistake number 88. Paucity of imagination about what a first cause might be. So, a super duper common mistake made when discussing the Kalam is just a sheer lack of imagination about what a first cause might be. Many people will simply assume that it must be the traditional theistic God or something very much like it. But this is to overlook boatloads of potential candidates for what the first cause might be. Candidates that are, absent some very good reason to think otherwise, possible for all we know. And here's just a small sampling of potential candidates for what the first cause might be. We can break them down into non-naturalistic first causes and naturalistic first causes. On the non-naturalistic side, well, you have a deistic God, right? For instance, Draper's aesthetic deism. This would be a God which, instead of being attuned to and motivated by moral considerations, is instead exclusively attuned to and motivated by aesthetic considerations. So aesthetic deism implies that an eternal, non-physical, omnipotent, and omniscient being created the physical world. The only difference then between the God of omnitheism and the deity of aesthetic theism is what motivates them. An omnitheistic God would be morally perfect, and so strongly motivated by considerations of the well-being of sentient creatures. By contrast, an aesthetic deistic God would prioritize aesthetic goods over moral ones. While such a being would want a beautiful universe, perhaps the best metaphor here is not that of a cosmic artist, but instead that of a cosmic playwright, an author of nature who wants above all to write an interesting story. So that's one non-naturalistic proposal alternative to the traditional theistic God. Another one is Goff's limited God, Philip Goff, that is. This God would either be limited in knowledge, or limited in power, or limited in goodness. On the non-naturalistic side, potential first causes also include angelic kinds of beings. Moreover, the Thomistic ultimate reality can be construed in a way friendly to atheism. Just construe the purely actual subsistent being itself as impersonal, which in fact is what many have argued Thomism collapses into. But note that this point here doesn't require making any such argument, right? One simply needs to take the idea that there's a foundational reality, being itself, which is purely actual and which has an essence identical to its existence, and simply characterize it purely impersonally. So that's yet another non-naturalistic candidate, a kind of atheistically construed Thomistic ultimate reality, which serves as the first cause. Similarly, one might go for an impersonal understanding of Plotinus as one. Right? Plotinus was a Neoplatonic philosopher who posited an absolutely simple, foundational, transcendent, concrete reality, which is the source of the existence and unity and oneness of every composite reality. So long as we characterize such a thing impersonally, this is going to come out as a non-naturalistic but non-theistic candidate for what a first cause might be. Similarly, there are impersonal conceptions of Brahman, which is this pervasive, infinite, unchanging, eternal concrete reality of pure, unchanging consciousness. And note that under some versions of Hinduism, this consciousness isn't personal or possessed by some person. The non-naturalistic first cause might be the Tao, a powerful, undifferentiated ultimate reality that figures in certain Eastern religions, etc. Again, this is a very small sampling of non-naturalistic but not traditional theistic candidates for what the first cause might be. Then there are, of course, naturalistic proposals. The first cause might be a non-spatiotemporal universal wave function. It might be some special quantum field, or some special point particle, or some sort of superstring-like entity, or some higher dimensional physical reality, and so on. And as I say here, even philosophers fall into this total paucity of imagination as to what a first cause might be. In other words, even philosophers fall into mistake number 88. Consider, for instance, William Lane Craig, who writes the following. I can't think of any other kind of object which philosophers have taken to exist timelessly apart from God and various abstract objects. No material, concrete object can exist timelessly, since there will always be at least atomic motion going on. So, a timelessly existing concrete object other than God would have to be something like an angelic being, but these are not normally taken to exist timelessly. Now, I say here that Craig's imagination seems to me to be incredibly limited. I mean, come on, Brahman, the Tao, the Neoplatonic One, an impersonally construed Thomistic ultimate reality, the aesthetic deistic being, the non-spatio-temporal universal wave function, etc., etc., etc. All these things have been or can be taken to exist timelessly, along with countless other proposals. Craig also simply asserts, without any justification whatsoever, that there will always be at least atomic motion going on when it comes to material or physical realities. But in fact, this just begs the very question at issue, right? The very question at issue is whether there could be a timeless and hence motionless physical thing. And so to assert that any physical thing must involve motion is simply to assume the very point of contention. And he's also just wrong that atomic motion must be going on. We know for a fact that there were no atoms in the early stages of the universe's expansion, and so there wasn't any motion of atoms then, even though there was physicality. And of course, there isn't atomic motion when it comes to, like, physical fields, which are generally taken by contemporary physicists to be more fundamental than particles. And finally, Craig overlooks serious, epistemically live proposals in physics on which there exist perfectly well-defined, perfectly coherent, timeless physical things. Again, certain views of the universal wave function, a timeless force space, and so on. See, again, my discussion with Dr. Daniel Linford for more on these points. Another point worth addressing here is Craig's claim that quantum systems are in a constant state of flux and hence cannot exist timelessly. But this is wrong-headed for several reasons. First, just because the quantum systems in our experience are constantly changing, it doesn't follow that any possible quantum system whatsoever must constantly change. And indeed, we wouldn't expect quantum systems around us now to behave in the same way that they do around the origin of our entire spatiotemporal manifold, assuming that it has an origin. Secondly, we know that the origin of the universe was not the result of the operations of the laws of quantum mechanics as they are currently understood. In particular, it is known that existing quantum theories must be replaced by a quantum theory of gravity to describe the very early universe. We currently don't have a well-established physical theory that accurately describes the very early universe, and so even if our current understanding of quantum mechanics implies or suggests that any quantum system whatsoever must constantly change, it's illegitimate to apply that current understanding to a situation in which we know it's inapplicable. As the burgeoning field of quantum cosmology illustrates, the appropriate physical description of the very early universe is still an open question. And as I've pointed out, there are physically live models which include timeless physical things. And furthermore, as Fodor rightly notes, even if a physical scientific description of the origin of the universe cannot be provided, it is still possible to develop philosophical accounts of the cause of the universe in terms of material or physical entities. Craig himself, of course, does not offer a scientific account of the cause of the universe, but only a philosophical one, right? So we can hardly criticize a physicalist account on this basis. As an example of what such an account might look like, we can imagine that the beginning of the universe may have been caused by a new type of particle or field, which is capable of existing changelessly outside of time. This primeval atom, as we may call it, would have been the cause of the beginning of the temporal universe by giving rise to the Big Bang. Since Craig is the one who is attempting to argue that the beginning of the universe constitutes evidence for God's existence, he therefore bears the burden of proof to show that these other possibilities are either implausible or ruled out altogether. So, in summary of mistake number 88, please just don't succumb to this paucity of imagination as to what a first cause might be. There are boatloads of at least seemingly epistemically possible candidates for what it might be, both naturalistic and non-naturalistic, other than the traditional theistic God. Alright, mistake number 89, assuming that indeterminism implies being uncaused. Just because an event is not determined or deterministically caused by prior conditions, that does not mean that it's utterly uncaused. It may simply have an indeterministic cause. That is, a cause whose presence in fact brings about the effect, but whose presence does not necessitate the coming about of the effect. In other words, in cases of indeterministic causation, it could have been the case that the same causal conditions obtained even though the effect didn't. Please stop assuming that the mere fact that indeterminism is present implies that there are uncaused events. No, that does not follow. Alright, mistake number 90, merely assuming a tensed view of time in defending the Kalam. Some people will defend the Kalam or certain arguments for certain premises of the Kalam, and in so doing, they'll sometimes simply assume a tensed theory of time without recognizing that this is a monumentally controversial assumption in need of significant justification and defense. According to a tense theory of time, very roughly, the past, present, and future tenses pick out objective, fundamental features of reality. There's a kind of objective, mind-independent, genuine sense in which kind of reality dynamically evolves over time, like things like really kind of spring into being and so on. And of course, this view of time is monumentally controversial, and it's in need of significant justification and defense. So just be aware and be attuned to the need for justification of this controversial assumption whenever you see someone making the assumption in the context of the Kalam. Mistake number 91, mistakes surrounding Hilbert's Hotel. Now, there are so many mistakes surrounding Hilbert's Hotel that we would probably be up to mistake number like 312 if I went into all of them. But I'll just pick one. And for more, you could just see my Hilbert's Hotel video. So oftentimes in talking about Hilbert's Hotel, people will say things like, well, hey, one or even infinitely many guests can be added or removed to the hotel without changing the number of guests in the hotel. But surely, though, there are more guests after the addition of guests and fewer guests after the removal of guests. Isn't that just absurd? Well, no, it's not. After guests are added, there certainly are more hotel guests in the following sense. All the guests present before the addition are present after the addition, and other guests are present as well. This is a perfectly adequate sense of more guests. The hotel afterwards has all the guests as before, and then some, right? The only sense in which there aren't more guests is the sense in which the cardinality of the set of guests after the addition is the same as the cardinality of the set of guests before the addition. But of course, there's nothing absurd about that, right? In standard Cantorian set theory, two sets having the same cardinality is just defined as there being a one-to-one correspondence between them. And clearly there's a one-to-one correspondence between the set of guests before new guests arrive and the set of guests after new guests arrive. So yes, the cardinality of the collection of guests doesn't change as a result of the addition, but there's nothing absurd about that. It's definitionally true. So yes, you actually can say that there are more guests after the addition of guests. It's just we have to get clear on what we mean by more. And again, the same thing can be said about removal of guests. Many more mistakes are here besides. See my Hilbert's Hotel video for more, but we're moving on to mistake number 92, the claim that causal finitism automatically entails a finite past. Now, causal finitism is the view that nothing can have infinitely many causes within its causal history. Importantly, causal finitism doesn't automatically, all by itself, entail the finitude of the past. You need to add some additional claims in order to get that entailment, and whether those additional claims are true is up for debate. Right, so here's at least one conceptually possible way in which the past may be infinite, even though there are no infinite causal chains, and indeed even though there couldn't be such chains if we're assuming causal finitism. Just suppose that the infinite past is populated exclusively by infinitely many partially temporally overlapping finite causal chains. Right? Imagine that each causal chain is only like 10 seconds long and has only 10 members, each of which lasts for 1 second. But it's just that you have these temporally overlapping one another. So one of them occurs for 10 seconds, and then another one starts halfway through that one, right? And then another one starts halfway through that one. And then another one starts halfway through that one, and so on. And just imagine that this has been going on throughout the entirety of an infinite past. Well, in that case, right, the past would be infinite, right, because we have infinitely many finitely long causal chains which are partially overlapping, but which still are stretching out infinitely into the past, and yet each such chain only has finitely many members. So every causal chain is finite, even though the past is infinite. Again, at least under this kind of conceptual possibility. My point here isn't to make a positive case for thinking that this sort of scenario really occurs or is really possible. Instead, my point is simply to highlight that the burden is on the one trying to infer past finitude from causal finitism to rule this sort of scenario out, right? They need to positively show that it couldn't obtain, right? The burden isn't on me to show that it really could. And then the final mistake pertaining to the Kalam that we're going to cover is mistake number 93, totally overlooking arguments for the possibility of actual infinites. I consider a number of these arguments in my Hilbert's Hotel video here and in my new objections to the Kalam video here. I'm not going to go into them right now because that would take too much time. But there are actually lots of arguments that people are totally oblivious to for the possibility of actual infinites. And even if there are good arguments for the impossibility of actual infinites, the weight of those arguments need to be balanced against the weight of the arguments for the possibility of actual infinites, deriving from conceivability, various other modal epistemological tools, deriving from what some of our best physical theories say about the nature and structure of physical reality, deriving from realism about mathematical objects, and so on down the list. Again, like I said, we're not going to go into them here, but my point is that they cannot be overlooked, and so often people just totally overlook these arguments. And that, of course, concludes the Kalam section of this video on common mistakes in philosophy of religion, and now we're moving on to the contingency argument section. So, mistake number 94. Atheists cannot answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? As I say here, this is a mistake. This claim is not plausible. The atheist can answer the question in a way similar to how theists have traditionally answered it.
There's something rather than nothing because there couldn't have been nothing. It must have been the case that something exists. Now, this answer can be taken in at least two directions. First, one could simply say that necessarily something or other exists, without saying that any particular object is such that that object necessarily exists. But maybe a more satisfying direction to take the answer is that some object or objects necessarily exist. And indeed, there are boatloads of coherent ways for atheists to take some object or objects to exist necessarily and to be the foundation of reality. They could take the necessary foundation of reality to be any number of things, ranging from quantum fields to fundamental particles to the universal wave function to the universe as a whole to non-theistic understandings of Brahman, the Tao, the Neoplatonic One, and countless other options besides. I'll give a brief, incomplete list later in the video, but in short, it's just wrong to say that atheists have no answer to the question, or cannot answer the question, why there is something rather than nothing. They can essentially make very similar moves to traditional theists in answering the question by positing a necessary foundation to reality. It's just that their necessary foundation, unlike the theists, isn't God. And also, there are other sorts of answers besides taking something to necessarily exist. For instance, there's the probabilistic answer defended by Peter Van Inwagen, Robert Nozick, and recently Paul Draper on my channel. See his discussion with Josh Rasmussen here if you're interested in that. The point here, though, is not to defend any particular response, but to highlight that atheists do indeed have coherent and prima facie reasonable answers to the question. That is, answers to the question that are at least reasonable on their face. Okay, mistake number 95. Merely assuming that a necessary thing can't cause or otherwise explain contingent things. Very often when I see non-theists objecting to the contingency argument, they'll merely assume that a necessary thing can't cause or otherwise explain contingent things, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't be contingent. They're sort of necessary consequences of something that's necessary, and hence they'd have to be necessary. That's one of the guiding ideas behind this thought. But when people make this argument, especially on the internet, oftentimes they simply assume that causation or explanation must be a necessitating relation. That is, if A causes or explains B, then A must therefore necessitate B. In other words, there can't be indeterministic causation or explanatory relations. Now, there are, of course, ways you can argue for that, but it certainly can't just be assumed, and it's not immediately obvious. At least by my lights, a necessary thing might indeterministically explain contingent things, where an indeterministic explanation is one where the explanans, that is, the thing doing the explaining, does not necessitate the explanandum, that is, the thing being explained, but nevertheless still removes mystery as to why the explanandum obtains. There are entirely coherent models of indeterministic causation, for instance, given to us by certain interpretations of quantum mechanics. There are also at least prima facie coherent models of libertarian freedom involving indeterministic causation, or some other indeterministic explanatory relation. So the mistake here lies in this assumption. Again, there are ways one might be able to argue for this, but it certainly cannot just be assumed, and it's not immediately obvious. People need to roll up their sleeves and do the heavy work of justifying it. Alright, mistake number 96. It's this claim: I can conceive of a universe or some physical thing not existing, and therefore the universe or that physical thing must be contingent. Now, I don't think this move is a clear and obvious mistake per se. Rather, what I think is mistaken is making this move without sufficient appreciation for the significant difficulties attending it. These difficulties may not be insuperable, but they're certainly there, and people often make appeals to conceivability without even being aware of them. It's that I think is a mistake. So then, what are these difficulties? Well, I'll just mention two. First, it's not clear that conceivability is good evidence for metaphysical possibility in contexts that are far removed from our ordinary humdrum experience. And here we're going to look at some things that Felipe Leon helpfully summarizes in his book with Josh Rasmussen entitled Is God the Best Explanation of Things? So Felipe Leon here has a section on the scope of our modal knowledge. That is, our knowledge of metaphysical possibility and necessity. What's really genuinely possible, what really could have obtained in reality, and what could not have obtained in reality, and what must have obtained in reality. Now, especially in the past, philosophers have assumed that the scope of our modal knowledge is sufficiently vast to justify modal claims that are significantly remote from ordinary experience, such as that it's possible that there could have been no material objects at all. But while there is a long tradition of such an assumption in the history of philosophy, contemporary philosophers have become increasingly leery of it. Perhaps the most well-known difficulty with justifying modal claims about the universe as a whole is that some metaphysical necessities are only knowable through experience. We cannot simply access these modal facts from our favorite armchair via imagination or conception. There are additional difficulties, and I'll briefly mention three here. First, as I and others have argued elsewhere, many, if not most, imagined scenarios that are at least modestly remote from human experience are such that when we try to flesh out the details about what they would involve, we quickly find that it is no longer clear that the envisioned scenario is metaphysically possible. To be clear, these sorts of cases do not clearly show that what we imagine is metaphysically impossible. However, they do seem to shift the burden of proof back onto the person who claims that they know or justifiably believe that such things are possible. So, for example, it seems that I can imagine a bar of iron floating on the surface of a body of water. At first, I feel confident that the floating bar is at least metaphysically possible. But that confidence quickly deflates once I start to consider some of the details about what this would involve. For example, changing the properties of a bar of iron so as to make it float requires changing its gravitational properties, which in turn requires changing its specific density, which in turn requires changing either the size of its unit cells or the number and kinds of atoms within them. In either case, these molecular changes are sufficient to render the bar no longer iron. Therefore, changing the properties of iron so as to make it float results in non-iron. In fact, iron is a transition metal, lying between manganese and cobalt on the periodic table. Thus, the range of possible densities for iron is highly restricted by these neighboring transition elements. But such leeway for changes in density isn't anywhere near what's required to make iron float. It is therefore no longer clear that floating iron bars are metaphysically possible. In the above example, we came to realize certain details about the case that were relevant to whether floating bars of iron are metaphysically possible. We also came to realize that it's not at all clear whether the details of the case could be worked out in a way that is compatible with that possibility claim. Because of these facts, the case above provides an undercutting defeater, that is, some consideration that removes something's justification or justification conferring power. Because of these facts, the case above provides an undercutting defeater for the original seeming that floating bars of iron are metaphysically possible. But the problem generalizes to very many possibility claims that are remote from ordinary experience. Second, some argue that a permissible freewheeling approach to modal judgments about possibilities admits of too many false positives. So, for example, we cannot rule it out as impossible that Goldbach's conjecture is false, even after reflection. If that were enough to make it reasonable to believe that it's possibly false, well then given that Goldbach's conjecture is necessarily true if true at all, right, it's a mathematical claim, it's really either just necessary or impossible. So if it's true at all, it's going to have to be necessarily true. And if it's false at all, it's going to have to be necessarily false. And so if we're reasonable in believing that it's possibly false, we'd be reasonable in believing that it's possibly necessarily false. And given the standard system of modal logic that's accepted by a significant portion of philosophers, that's going to entail that it's actually false. But despite this result, Felipe writes, I'm hesitant to submit my findings to the annals of mathematics. That's bad enough, but it gets worse, right? I not only fail to see any incoherence in the possible falsity of Goldbach's conjecture, but I also fail to see an incoherence in its possible truth. Therefore, by the above reasoning, it now seems we have good evidence for both the possible truth and the possible falsehood of Goldbach's conjecture, in which case we'd have to conclude absurdly that Goldbach's conjecture is a contingent truth. All this goes to show that there's reason to worry that an unfettered freewheeling approach to modal knowledge may very well be on shaky ground. Third, some argue that our account of modal knowledge should mesh nicely with what we have reason to believe in other areas, such as modal psychology and evolutionary explanations of the etiology or causal origins of modal knowledge. So, for instance, Timothy Williamson and Sean Nichols have independently argued that the ability to reason about nearby, but not remote possibilities is conducive to survival, in virtue of giving us the ability to evaluate risks and opportunities, perhaps by mentally simulating counterfactual scenarios. That is, scenarios that are contrary to actual fact. But while it's sensible enough to think that such an evolved ability would enable us to have knowledge of unactualized possibilities similar to ordinary experience, it's not at all clear that such an ability would allow us to have knowledge of far-out possibilities that are very removed or quite remote from ordinary experience. In view of the sorts of reasons above, among others, there's a growing trend in the epistemology of modality to construct an account of our knowledge of possibility that draws a principled line between justified and unjustified modal claims, where this line coincides with a principled line between nearby and remote possibility claims. Most of these trace our knowledge to possibility back to our empirical knowledge of the actual world, at least in large part. Anyway, Felipe goes on to detail some of these and give citations, etc. You can pursue those in case you're interested. My sole purpose in bringing all this up is to highlight that there are at least reasonable difficulties that attend this move up here. This confident move from being able to conceive of the universe or some physical thing not existing to thinking that therefore it's possibly non-existent and hence that it's contingent. And so I was just going through some reasons that philosophers have offered for thinking that it's actually not very clear that conceivability is good evidence for metaphysical possibility, at least in contexts that are far removed from our ordinary humdrum experience, such as the whole universe not existing, or some very abstractly characterized physical thing remote from our ordinary experience not existing. And so the second difficulty that I want to mention is that I can equally conceive of God's non-existence, as well as the truth of various non-theistic worldviews. If the conceivable non-existence of the universe licenses us to infer that the universe could fail to exist, well then equally, the conceivable non-existence of God, as well as the conceivable truth of various non-theistic worldviews, would likewise license us to infer that God could fail to exist, or that those various non-theistic worldviews could be true. And so we'd have equal grounds for thinking that God is contingent, and of course the person who is saying this is very likely not going to want to accept that conclusion. I note here that we can also easily conceive of a world whose non-divine conscious creatures experience nothing but protracted, horrific, unredeemed, utterly gratuitous evil. If the conceivability of such a world licenses us to infer that it's a possible world, well then we can also infer that God possibly doesn't exist. There's some world in which God doesn't exist, since a perfect being couldn't actualize a world like that. God just would never actualize a world like that. So these are two difficulties that I want to mention for people who make mistake number 96. Onwards we march, though, to mistake number 97, which is claiming that composition, including mere metaphysical composition, entails contingency. And by the way, you can think of metaphysical composition as basically just like having distinct properties, something like that. Or at least distinct intrinsic properties. Properties that characterize something as it is in itself, and not as it relates to or connects to things sort of outside of itself. These properties, in some manner, like, make up the thing. They kind of constitute its being, as it were. They're metaphysical components of it, as opposed to physical components. I'm not saying I believe in this, of course. I'm just characterizing what metaphysical composition is supposed to be in order to allow us to be able to understand mistake number 97. So yeah, mistake number 97 is claiming that composition, including mere metaphysical composition, entails contingency, so any composite object must be contingent. I admit to finding this one utterly bizarre, and I'm going to bring us to the top of page 168 of my book to explain why. The reason contingent things are contingent is not that contingent things are composed of parts, or that contingent things have potentialities and actualities. Consider the number 2. Plausibly, the number 2 has various properties, such as the property being even. But, by the lights of those who accept a broadly classical theistic understanding of parthood, the metaphysical composition that I just mentioned, anything with various properties is going to count as a composite thing. Right? This is one reason that classical theists specifically deny that God has a multiplicity of properties. Right? That would, by their lights, entail that God has parts, whereas God is simple. Thus, the number 2 is a composite thing. But the number 2 is not a contingent thing, right? The number 2 does not just happen to exist in some possible worlds and not others, or on Tuesdays but not on Wednesdays. No, the number 2 must exist. Or pick your favorite sort of abstract object, like mathematical objects, or propositions, or etc. So what this shows is that composition does not imply contingency, and hence the reason why contingent entities are contingent is not that such entities are composed of parts. Or consider a view on which God is timeless, immutable, impassible, necessarily existent, but nevertheless has some potential for cross-world variance. Obviously, nothing about God so construed having distinct properties, and nothing about God so construed having some potential for cross-world variance compromises his being metaphysically necessarily existent. In short, there just seems to be nothing wrong with there being a composite object, all of whose parts necessarily exist, and all of whose parts are necessarily conjoined with one another so as to make up the relevant thing. So I don't see any issue whatsoever in there being a necessary but composite thing, and people are often far too quick in basically merely asserting that composition entails contingency. Or they think that if something is composite, well then it could sort of decompose into its parts. Why? Why think that? The number 2 can't decompose into its parts of being even and being the successor of one and what? And if God has distinct properties, it's not as though God could decompose. What? No. So it's just not at all plausible in my view to say that composition entails contingency for the reasons just canvassed. On to mistake number 98, which is the claim that the only kinds of explanations are personal explanations and scientific explanations. Now, I kind of went off on this because it triggered me so much in this video here, which is just extracted from my 12-hour-long video. But I'm not going to go into that for the sake of time. You can check that out if you are interested. Here's the little timestamp. And the link to this video in particular, if you don't want to search it up on my channel, again, is in the resource document. So I'm not going to go through the detailed explanation of why this is a mistake. Instead, I'm just going to note that we already saw earlier in this very video that you're watching boatloads of other sorts of explanations other than personal explanations, which cite the intentions of some personal being, and other than scientific explanations, which cite past states of the universe in conjunction with physical laws. Again, there are moral explanations, purely mathematical explanations, mathematical or structural explanations of features of concrete reality, grounding-style explanations, explanations appealing to essentialist facts, functional realization explanations, necessity explanations, or equivalently, impossibility of the contrary explanations, identity explanations, theological explanations, abstract explanations, and so many more. So if you ever see someone claim, or if you ever see an argument, one of whose premises states that the only kinds of explanations are personal and scientific explanations, you have my permission to roll your eyes and just click away from the screen. All right, mistake number 99, confusing contingency with dependence and necessity with independence. This one is huge. We should first distinguish, I think, contingent propositions from contingent things. Okay? Propositions, as philosophers understand them, are basically just the meanings of declarative sentences. They're what declarative sentences express. And they're the fundamental bearers of truth value. If you don't like propositions, we can make this point in terms of statements. So you can just think of contingent statements. But anyway, among propositions, there's a fourfold categorization. Okay? There are contingently true propositions. There are contingently false propositions. There are necessarily true propositions. And there are necessarily false propositions. Now, a contingently true proposition is a proposition which is actually true, but it could have been false. Okay, so it's true in the actual world, but there's some possible world in which it's false. A possible world, by the way, is just a complete or comprehensive way that reality could be, down to every last detail. Here's some examples of contingently true propositions. I exist, right? That's true, but it's not necessarily true. Like, I could have failed to exist. So this statement here is true, but it could have been false. Dogs exist, right? That's true, but it could have been false. There could have been no dogs. My favorite soccer or football team is Arsenal. Again, true, but it could have been false. So that's contingently true propositions. There are also contingently false propositions. These are propositions that are actually false, but they could have been true. Right? So they're false in the actual world, but there's some possible world in which they're true. Examples, I have 3 brothers. That is not true, but it could have been true. My parents could have had one other male child. Similarly, Martians exist. That's not true. There are no Martians, right? So it's false to say that Martians exist. But it's only contingently false because it could have been true, right? It's not like it's impossible for Martians to exist. And this one might actually be impossible. That my favorite soccer or football team is Tottenham. So maybe that's not a good example. But anyway, onwards we march to necessarily true propositions. A necessarily true proposition is a proposition that cannot fail to be true. In other words, it must be true, right? Its falsity is literally impossible. So it could not have been false. It must have been true. In other words, it's true in every possible world. It's true in every way that reality could have been. Here are some examples. 1 + 1 = 2. Water is H2O. Right? Water couldn't have been H3O. That just wouldn't be water. Likewise, it's necessarily true that if something is a dog, then it's a mammal. Here's something else that's necessarily true. It's necessarily true that no prime number is a human being. And finally, we have necessarily false propositions, or in other words, impossible propositions. A proposition is necessarily false just in case it cannot fail to be false. Right? It must be false. Its truth is literally impossible. So it could not have been true. They're false, in other words, in every possible world. They're false in every way that reality could be. Here's some examples. 420 = 69. Water is H3O. Again, that's necessarily false. I am identical to a scrambled egg. No, I could not have been identical to a scrambled egg. And here's another thing that's impossible. It's impossible for something to be red all over and green all over at one and the same time. Finally, a quote-unquote contingent proposition is usually a blanket term for a proposition which is true in some but not all possible worlds. That is, it's true in some possible worlds, but it's false in other possible worlds. But anyway, we've now obtained some clarity on propositions and fourfold modal distinctions among them, but now we need some clarity on things, like objects, or events, or states of affairs, etc. Now, as philosophers understand these terms, a thing is contingent, just in case it exists, but could have failed to exist. Whereas a thing is necessary, just in case it exists and cannot fail to exist. To put it in terms of possible worlds, a contingent thing exists, but there's some possible world in which it fails to exist. By contrast, a necessary thing exists in all possible worlds. So, for instance, if numbers exist, then they're quite plausibly necessary, since they plausibly cannot fail to exist, right? They exist in all possible worlds. By contrast, I'm contingent, since I exist, but I could have failed to exist, if, for instance, my parents never met. Now, notice that these modal notions are very different from the explanatory notion of dependence. Something explanatorily depends on something else when the former in some way owes its existence or its character to the latter. Right? The former is the way it is, or perhaps just exists, because the latter is the way it is, or because the latter performs some activity, or because the latter exists. So yeah, as I say here, when x depends on y, x exists or is the way it is because y exists or is the way that it is. By contrast, when x is independent, it does not owe its existence or its character, that is the way that it is, to something else. So notice that this is different from the modal notions of being contingent and being necessary. Right? To be a contingent object is to be such that it exists, but it can fail to exist. That's very different from being such that it depends on another, like its existence or its character is owed to another in some way, or it has its existence or its character because of something else. And similarly, Being necessary is very different from being independent, right? To be necessary is just to be such that it cannot fail to exist. It must exist. Whereas to be independent, it's not going to depend on something else for its existence. And of course, we could distinguish here between having an independent existence and having an independent character. Something has an independent existence just in case it doesn't owe its existence to anything else. Its existence isn't sort of explained by anything else. And similarly, something has an independent character when the way that it is not explained by anything else. And the way that it is doesn't depend on anything else. The way that it is isn't owed to something else. So yeah, as I emphasize here, the modal distinction between contingent and necessary should not be confused with the explanatory distinction between dependent and independent. In principle, there are 4 conceptual possibilities or permutations here, right? So on the left-hand side, we've got dependent and independent. On the top, we've got contingent, which means exists but can fail to exist. And we've got necessary, which means that it cannot fail to exist. And notice that there are sort of 4 conceptual possibilities here. You could have a dependent contingent thing. Arguably, I'm an example of that, right? I'm contingent. I could have failed to exist. And I'm dependent, right? I owe my existence in part to my parents, right? So I'm a dependent contingent thing. Another conceptual possibility is an independent contingent thing. At least some atheists think that the universe is contingent, that is, that the universe exists, but it could have failed to exist. And also that nothing accounts for why the universe exists, nothing explains that the universe doesn't depend on anything. So the universe then would be an independent contingent thing. Some theists, it's a minority, but some theists think that God is contingent. God could have failed to exist, but God doesn't depend on anything for God's existence. God is independent, so God would be something that's independent and contingent. Turning now to the necessary side, another conceptual possibility is a dependent necessary thing. Some people think that God, a necessary being, necessarily created or sort of necessarily emanated out the universe. In that case, the universe would be necessary, right, because it cannot fail to exist, but it would nevertheless be dependent because it owes its existence to God. Other examples of dependent necessary things might include the set of the natural numbers. So if you take a broadly mathematical realist view, we're probably going to think that there are both sets and numbers, and we're probably going to think that sets depend for their existence or their character on their elements that they contain. And so the set containing the natural numbers will depend for its existence on the natural numbers being there, even though both of them are going to be necessary, even though all the natural numbers are necessarily existent, and the set containing them is necessarily existent as well. So we have a dependent necessary thing here. Or consider like God's beliefs, for instance, like God believes that 1 + 1 = 2. God necessarily has that belief. So that belief, in some manner, cannot fail to be, it cannot fail to exist. That belief necessarily exists. But that belief plausibly depends on God, right? Beliefs aren't just like independent things. No, they depend on the believers who hold them. So that could be another example of something that's dependent but necessary. And then finally, independent but necessary. Many theists think that God necessarily exists and that God is independent. God doesn't depend on anything for his existence. Similarly, some non-theists think that some non-God object or some non-God thing exists necessarily, but doesn't derive its existence from anything. It's an independent, necessary thing. So these distinctions, in principle, and conceptually speaking, can cross-cut one another. So do not confuse contingency with dependence, do not confuse necessity with independence, and don't confuse the distinction between contingent and necessary with the distinction between dependent and independent. Alright, on to mistake number 100, confusing necessarily existent with couldn't have been otherwise. That is, couldn't have been different in any way whatsoever. No, please do not confuse those. Just because something necessarily exists, that doesn't mean that it couldn't have been otherwise in any way whatsoever. Right? For something to necessarily exist simply means that it exists in all possible worlds. Right? It's unable to fail to exist. But that doesn't mean that all of its properties exist in all possible worlds. Right? It may have one collection of properties in some worlds, but different collections of properties in all other worlds. Right? Take God as an example. Right? Assuming that God exists, God is plausibly a necessary being. That is, he necessarily exists. But that clearly doesn't mean that God couldn't have been different in any way whatsoever. Right? I mean, like, clearly God could have had different beliefs, for instance, right? If God had created different creatures, he would have had different beliefs, such as the belief that he created those creatures. Likewise, God could have had different intentions. For example, instead of intending to actualize this world, he could have instead intended to actualize a different world. But clearly none of this compromises God's status as a necessary being. So in general, it's at least conceptually possible for a necessary being to vary in its properties across worlds. All that necessarily existing implies is existing in all possible worlds. It does not imply having all the same properties in all possible worlds. In principle, necessarily existent things can still vary in some of their accidental properties across worlds. Accidental properties are just non-essential properties. Essential properties are those properties that something cannot exist without. Whereas accidental properties are those properties that something can exist without. So yeah, necessarily existing things can still vary in some of their accidental properties across worlds. That clearly doesn't prevent the being from existing in all possible worlds. It just means that the being has some properties in some worlds, but different properties in other worlds. But the being still exists in all the relevant possible worlds, and so it's still necessary, despite the fact that it's not true that it couldn't have been otherwise. In other words, despite the fact that it could have been otherwise, it's still necessarily existent. So, don't confuse necessary existence with the impossibility of being otherwise. Alright, mistake number 101. If something begins, or something begins to exist, it can't be necessary. Now, this is often just asserted, but it's not clear why it would be true. Right? You might think that in principle, something could begin to exist in every possible world. Right? In that case, it would exist necessarily, since it exists in all possible worlds, even though it also begins to exist, and indeed it begins to exist in all possible worlds. Of course, I grant that under some usages of the term necessary, yes, under some usages, that's going to prevent something which is necessary from being able to begin to exist. I grant that. But again, I'm just using the standard previously articulated usage of what it is to exist necessarily. What matters isn't the semantics here, but rather that we see certain conceptual distinctions and that some things don't imply others given how we define them. So what matters ultimately is that you understand the relevant distinctions and how some of them can cross-cut, how some of them bear entailment relations to one another, and how some of them fail to bear entailment relations to one another. Alright, mistake number 102. Necessary truths can't be explained. This is deeply implausible, at least in my view. In discussing non-causal explanations earlier in this video, I already gave lots of examples of explanations of necessary truths, right? So for instance, the Pythagorean theorem is necessarily true, but it's not like it's some brute, inexplicable fact, right? We can explain it in terms of more fundamental axioms and rules of inference within Euclidean geometry, such as the parallel postulate. Plausibly as well, one might think that there are numbers and sets, and if so, then the set containing the natural numbers would plausibly necessarily exist. And yet, as philosophers generally recognize, sets depend for their existence and identity on their elements, right? It's because those precise elements exist that the set containing them exists and has the identity that it has. So then, the set containing the natural numbers would be necessary, and yet explained in terms of more fundamental necessary things, namely the natural numbers themselves. And again, whether or not we're actually realists about numbers and sets and whatnot, that's ultimately beside the point. What matters is that these open up the conceptual possibility of necessary truths being able to be explained, right? There's nothing incoherent in that. And so there doesn't seem to be any in principle objection to there being explanations for necessary truths. It also doesn't just, happen to be wrong, contingently, to, say, torture an innocent person, causing them immense suffering solely for the sake of the mild pleasure of the torturer. No, plausibly, that must be wrong. That's necessarily wrong. There's no world in which that's okay and permissible or good. And yet there are clear explanations for why that would be wrong. Right? For instance, it's an act of wanton cruelty, it produces horrific suffering, and so on. That at least partially accounts for why it's wrong. So again, there can be explanations for necessary truths. I could belabor this point even further by going through some things that Kenny Pierce writes on pages 185 to 186 of his debate book with Graham Oppie, but we're not going to do that. I hope you get the point. Oh, and as I say here, in general, just imagine that necessitarianism is true, right? The actual world is the only possible world. Clearly, this wouldn't imply that nothing explains anything, right? It would simply mean that whatever explanatory relations there are, necessarily obtain. Or me hitting my glass of water would still explain why my glass of water fell over and the water spilled, even though it was necessary that I hit the glass, and even though this necessarily caused my glass to fall over and my water to spill. So it just doesn't seem to follow from the fact that something is necessary that it can't then be explained. So, in short, please don't say that necessities cannot be explained. At least many of them can be. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that all necessary truths can be explained, and I'm also not saying that necessary truths must be explained. My point is simply that at least some necessities can be explained. In other words, my point is that it's a mistake to say that necessary truths cannot be explained in principle. Oh boy, this one is a huge mistake in internet philosophy of religion and apologetics discussions. It's mistake number 103, being far too swift in stage 2 of the contingency argument. And yes, I recognize that there really is no such thing as the contingency argument. Again, there are contingency arguments. What we're focusing on here, though, is being far too swift in stage 2 of those sorts of arguments. And stage 2 just tries to infer that the necessary object or objects arrived at in stage 1 of the argument must be God, or at least must be quite godlike. So, oftentimes, people just assume that a necessary foundational concrete object must be God. I think the underlying diagnosis of this mistake is simply a lack of imagination. The assumption here just overlooks boatloads of epistemically possible candidates for what the necessary foundation of reality might be. So again, we could break this up into naturalistic and non-naturalistic proposals. This is not an exhaustive survey, but on the side of naturalistic proposals, the necessary concrete foundation might be the universal wave function of Alyssa H, North, Julian Barber, etc. This is elaborated and expanded upon and developed in section 8.3 of my Springer book, co-authored with Dr. Daniel Linford. There's a huge literature, moreover, on this in Philosophy of Physics, literature that we engage with in that book, so you can check that out if you're interested. The necessary concrete foundation might be a collection of fundamental particles, like quarks, leptons, and bosons. The necessary concrete foundation might be a collection of mereological simples, that is, little itty-bitty constituents of reality that have no further constituents. This sort of view, on which the foundation of reality is a collection of enduring mereological simples, has been defended in a nice recent dissertation by Matteo Bonocci. The necessary concrete foundation might be superstrings. It might be one or more foundational quantum fields. It might be the universe as a whole, which may be the one fundamental concrete object that grounds its non-fundamental parts, as in Jonathan Schaffer's Priority Monism. You can see his paper here, as well as lots of other papers and lots of other literature that have blossomed off of it. The necessary concrete foundation might be Oppie's initial singularity that he's developed in various places. It could just be matter/energy broadly construed. It could be foundational structural relations that build up the rest of reality, as in ontic structural realism. There's a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry dedicated to just this sort of view, and there's a huge literature on it. The necessary foundation might be dynamical physical principles as the ultimate ground of concrete reality. Philosopher David Gunn defends this view in his 2021 article in Philosophers' Imprint entitled On the Ultimate Origination of Things. And again, this is not an exhaustive list of various naturalistic proposals for what the necessary concrete foundation might be. Turning now to non-naturalistic proposals, the necessary concrete foundation might be a deistic god. Consider again Draper's aesthetic deism. You could take Philip Goff's limited God hypothesis, wherein there's a deity at the foundation of reality who's either limited in knowledge or in power or in goodness. You could take the Thomistic ultimate reality, being itself, construed in a way friendly to atheism. Again, just construe the purely actual subsistent being itself as impersonal. You could take impersonal understandings of Plotinus' one, which again is an absolutely simple, foundational, transcendent concrete reality that explains the unity and existence of all composite things. Another non-naturalistic proposal for the necessary concrete foundation of reality is impersonal conceptions of Brahman, which is this pervasive, infinite, eternal concrete reality of pure, unchanging, aperspectival consciousness. Lots of fascinating literature on that. It might be the Tao, which is the non-theistic religious ultimate in various Eastern religions. It's this foundational, formless reality that's responsible for the variegated forms and properties of everything else. There are various axiarchic views, which posit fundamental necessary principles about value, which explain the character of concrete reality. Defenders of axiarchic views include John Leslie, Nicholas Rescher, and I believe Derek Parfit. But since I haven't studied that extensively, I'm going to request that you not quote me on that. And so on down the list of non-naturalistic proposals for what the necessary foundation might be. Again, these are just short glimpses into the swaths of naturalistic and non-naturalistic candidates for what a necessary foundation might be. Doubtless there are many others besides, but I just want to give you a taste of why it's a mistake to be too swift in the second stage of contingency arguments and assume that the necessary foundation of reality must be the traditional theistic God. And finally, the last mistake of this video, mistake number 104. All of this highlights that it's just wrong to say that naturalists can't accept a necessary being, and also wrong to say that naturalists have to reject the PSR. Those are two other mistakes that are commonly made. Naturalists can perfectly well accept the PSR, which says something like, of course there are different articulations of it, but some popular articulations in the context of contingency arguments go something like, hey, every contingent fact has an explanation, or every contingent thing has an explanation. Naturalists can perfectly well accept that. No, in short, naturalists do not have to reject the PSR. And yes, in short, naturalists can accept a necessary being. So that concludes part 3 in this 7-part series on common mistakes in internet, philosophy, and religion spheres. I hope it was edifying. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you gained a lot of value out of this. If you see value in the work that I do more generally, and in all the hours and effort and love and care and caution and rigor that I put into these videos and all of it, please consider supporting me on Patreon or making a one-time donation. Truly, any amount helps. It helps me through grad school, and it's helping me pay off my student debt, unironically. And of course, it's just helping keep the channel afloat, helping keep me motivated for these videos, and just reminding me that people do in fact see value in the work that I do. So thanks so much to all the existing patrons, and thank you for even considering it. And of course, what better way to end is there than, I'm Joe Schmid, this is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.